Hey there. Welcome to First Look, Sanctuary Edition. I like to be in here occasionally, just, because I like to see this place sometimes when no one's in here and just kind of float around. All right, we're creeping our way there. We're almost there. This is Advent week 4. And I feel like this is the time that if you've been holding back and trying to stay in Advent, and you've been trying to kind of be there in the waiting and then the participation and all that, I feel like this is the week where you can kind of like let the training wheels off finally and just kind of let it happen and do your thing, because it does start to feel a little bit more Christmassy. And we'll have. We're telling the Christmas story. We're doing that this week, and we may have some surprises along the way when it comes to how we tell that story. But I do want to spend some time this week just kind of thinking about it with you. But before I do, the other thing to know, besides the fact that this is the 4th week of Advent, is that we also are inviting 3 new people to be members, which is wonderful. And you'll get to, meet them along the way if you haven't already. And so, all of them have been people who have been participating in worship for a while and singing in our choir and doing different things. And so that's all wonderful and great. So the service has that tone to it, not only the happiness of doing something that's Christmassy, but then also, having the new members who are joining. So this story needs no introduction at all. I'm just going to read the passage that we have for this Sunday, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. But let me figure out where we are. Oh, here we are. Okay, I got to kind of set you down a little bit here. Okay, so this is the story according to Matthew. This is chapter 1, verses 18 through 25. So we're going to tell that part of the story. Okay, here we go. Now the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you will name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. Okay, so, okay, good. All right, so, a couple of things. First, that's the beginning of the Jesus story in terms of it being the birth story, but that's not the beginning of Matthew. Matthew takes us through a genealogy. That's the first thing that we see in the New Testament as it's written. Matthew taking us through this. And the goal of that is to make sure that people understand who Jesus is and why his birth is important, right? It's sort of giving a credence to him as Messiah, which you can understand as why that would be so important, given the fact that we're trying to introduce Jesus. He's not coming in royal birth. He's not doing any of those things, but he's being claimed as the Savior. And so they're putting the pieces together as to how we get there. And the way we get there is by Jesus being in the line of David. Now, what of course you love about the fact that this is true is that he wouldn't then biologically be of the line of David, which is like a wonderfully scandalous detail in this story. Because of course genealogy has and ancestry has so much to do with your identity as a person, not just today, but certainly even more so then. Mary is not of that line, but Joseph is. And Joseph is not the biological father of Jesus. And so you have this kind of marvelous story that from the very beginning tells the people something different about who they are. And that's why a story like Ruth's story is so important to tell, I think, at this time of year also, which is why you get it near the beginning of Advent, is that you have this this person who is not even from Israel, let alone from the right line or whatever, but marries into it, has a child with Boaz that becomes, that goes from her child, Jesse, David, down the line. And so there's just no way not to love that part of the story, because it tells us so much about the way that literally from the very beginning, God's presence in the world is going to follow that the standard. He's going to pay attention to it, but isn't going to be held by it. It's not going to be hemmed in by it. There's something kind of including about that, and something that goes beyond, human expectation. What it means to belong, what it means to be loved, what it means to be, in someone's life or in someone's family goes far beyond anything that we think that we're supposed to create. And, I think more and more, as we recognize that what it means to be family isn't some standard, we kind of treat it like there's one particular way of being family. And yet, over and over again, we read this story of Jesus like it isn't completely different than that. The story of Jesus is, about this unwed couple in this scandalous situation in a family that shouldn't have worked. There's a lot of explaining to do when it comes to how this family comes together, and nothing about it is standard. Nothing about it is the way that you would dream of, that Joseph and Mary would be wed, and then they would have a child, and then they would live together in a way that would have been, conducive with the culture that they lived. None of that happened. None of that happened. And yet here we have Jesus sort of living out this prophecy as one who doesn't really fit the prophecy perfectly. But then you also have all these other connections that they make sure that they make. Born in Bethlehem, and of this line, and following, in this kind of. There's something about that story that never gets old. No matter how many times you tell it and how many times you hear it, just the reminder of, what that means for us. And the theme of this week, I think the title is called "Love is Worth the Risk." And there's a lot we could say about that phrase, about that idea, love being worth the risk. And what I like about that is that's true in families, it's true in churches, it's true in relationships. It's true as a pet owner, that when you enter into a family or you take anyone into your family, that eventually you or that person is going to leave, and that there's going to be some kind of, pain or some kind of loss that comes just in being a person, just in interacting with the world around us. And we can try to avoid that as much as possible, but ask anyone who's loved, it's always worth the risk. And when you look at families and you look at life, there's always those elements of pain and loss. And certainly that was true in the life of Jesus, and that was true in the life of Mary and Joseph. And they were risking a lot being who they were. But that's what, that claim of it's worth it is still there. So, you look at that story, you look at that beginning, you think about your own family or the way it's sort of put together. And we talk about biological family and chosen family and all that. And I think this story only resonates more and more with us, as not only as time marches on, but as how we see and view family and how we talk about it begins to change. And when it comes to so connecting that for a minute to the fact that we're looking at this new membership, the new members who are coming on, and so it's hard enough to talk about the context of the Sunday whenever you're talking about a passage. What we have said, at least in my tenure here at Northmont, about what it means for people to come in and become new members or new parts of this community, is that, one, we know that the people who do are not all the same. They don't think about God all the same. They don't talk about God all the same. Their experience with church is not all the same. They don't all vote for the same person. They don't all read the same newspapers. They don't all watch the same news programs. And yet they work on being communities together in a way that I think is really vibrant and intentional. And I have always appreciated that. But the other thing that we talk about often in this church is how people, when you enter into this community, we expect that you will change it, that we will not be the same because you're here. You look at any person who's entered into this community since, at least in the last 7 years since I've been here, and they have all had this varying effect on just who we are, or who we say we are, what we do, what we claim, what we're about. Think about the people who have come into this church since then, and they've all changed it in some way. It's not just one of those things that you fold someone in. It's very intentional that we say, look, you can be a part of dozens of churches, and some of them will expect you to kind of assimilate, which I don't think is as true here. I think we really try to celebrate not only the differences, but the difference that you'll make. And it would be hard to imagine that wasn't also, you don't also see that being true in this story. That we are all different, not only because the people in the story, Mary and Joseph, take on this mantle, but I think they also, in their own specific ways, change the way that Jesus sees himself. And I think that's what we're trying to celebrate in the telling of this Advent story. That the stories and people around Jesus have an effect on who he is and how he ministers. The Ruth story, we talked about Orpah, and we talked about Ruth and Naomi, and then we go to John the Baptist and his influence on Jesus. And, we've talked not only this year, but in years past of, the tremendous kind of impact that I think Mary had on the life of Jesus. And I think Joseph did too. I think it is in a different way, but because we know so much more about Mary, we can talk more about Mary. And just the way that she approached life, you read the Magnificat, she is this tremendous human being. I think that we need to pay attention to her story and really understand how it influences his. His time as a refugee, his time, feeling very foreign, and which I think we kind of take for granted, but I've tried to tell that story a little bit and really highlight it. Because I think all those things, all those people and players, just add this really unique background and tapestry to who we understand Jesus to be. And so then I move on in this particular story, and I try to kind of think about the way that the story would have been received, I think, at the time, and why it's told the way that it is. Matthew's telling of the story, beginning with that genealogy, it says a lot about the recipients of the story and the kind of community they were, what they found important, but then also how knowing the information that's in the story would have changed them, would have changed the way that they saw things. I think one of the things to try to remember is even though we tell the biblical story as sort of one big long line, that there's these huge gaps in what we consider sacred. Not that the history of the people of Israel somehow skipped around. Obviously, there's lots of things that are happening between them coming back from exile and rebuilding the temple and rebuilding Jerusalem until Jesus. I mean, there's over 400 years there. Obviously, lots of things happen. But in terms of what we consider prophetic stories, God speaking to the people directly, something happening from that kind of, that has biblical implications. We do have this huge gap, and we're talking about over 400 years. It's like from now back to the Mayflower, that much time where nothing of prophetic substance, at least from the canon that we have in the Bible, happens. And so the need for Matthew to connect the dots between what would have been ancient, even then, ancient prophecy, and, because the things that he quotes are even older than, that exile time. To connect the dots between something that happened so long ago to what was happening in that moment. I mean, you can imagine how difficult that would be. Like, yeah, that happened back then, that happened to those people, but like this is now, this is present day, this is modern times, right? I mean, they're thinking about themselves as modern times, just as we think of ourselves living in modern times. And 500 years from now, people won't. They'll think of that as, the ancient day whenever they were using, Google and cars. So Matthew had to connect the dots for the people about, these aren't just ancient stories, this has right now implications. The stories that we heard, the prophecies that we heard, this is happening right now. And you can understand if I told you that someone that was in front of you was fulfilling a prophecy just by them existing, you'd be skeptical. Maybe you'd think I was, not altogether here. And so Matthew has to really emphasize and draw a line between, look, this is happening. This is all the things that we thought, might not ever happen, are going to happen right here in front of you. And it's going to change the way you understand the world. And at the same time, had to emphasize the fact that this Messiah was not going to look the way that people thought that he would. So just those two ideas, the amount of time that we're talking about between prophetic eras, and the fact that Jesus didn't resemble the kind of Messiah that people were told to look for, these were tremendous hurdles that they would have to overcome in order for people to accept Jesus as that person. And so this week, I think one of the things that I'd like you to maybe think about is the difficulty, I think, in trying to treat the stories that we hear as something that has this direct daily impact on our lives, and that it's not just some distant story. I think the realness of it, not just of it being real and true to our faith, but really about how it can impact the way that we interact with the world, expect things to be different, expect change, demand change, demand goodness in the world. I think that those are the things that I think we kind of hold our faith sometimes at arm's length because it doesn't feel like the real world. And some of it feels very distant because it all looks different and people talk different and act different, and we don't wear the same kind of clothing, and we don't speak the same language, and we're not all, shepherds and farmers, and that's not the life that we live. And so it feels very out there and very other. But I think one of the things to try to keep in mind and to try to practice as much as possible is the ways that I think we can expect our faith and expect what we read and expect what we try to live out in churches out into the world that we live. Not that we have to expect the world to follow some kind of biblical mandate, but that we bring the principles of that mandate of love and justice and peace into the world. Because I think that's the goal. Not to make the world like us, but to take who we are and affect the world for good, positive change that helps people. And that can come with, hope attached to it. I think that we look at that Advent wreath every year for a reason, because those things should remind us of what can be. And that's what we get to invite people into this Sunday. When we get to invite new members, we're inviting people into that story and inviting them to try to live out that expectation with us, which I think is a pretty great thing. So I look forward to telling the story again. I look forward to telling the story with you. I look forward to inviting new folks in with us, and seeing what's next, seeing what comes of it. So I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you for continuing to do this with us and to explore what Advent means. And I'll see you next time for another First Look. So take care.